Following up on last week when we talked about how the economy is measured, today we're going to talk about sources and policies on continuing to grow the economy in the long term or in the long run. What we're going to learn is that long run growth is only sustainable if government policies are set up and put in place to support risk taking. As we said last week, growth is determined by a continuous expansion of real GDP, which is GDP adjusted for the effects of inflation on the price level. We said in the first couple weeks of class that the free market system, one of the factors of production in a free market system is entrepreneurial risk. And we said during those sessions is that entrepreneurial risk needs to be rewarded. There needs to be some sort of return for someone taking the risk to put together the factors of production. That is what we're going to focus on today in Chapter 6. In the beginning of time, starting from about 1 million BC to present, there have been various degrees of economic growth. Prior to the Industrial Revolution in the mid to late 1800s in the United States and beginning in 1750 in England, economic growth was very slow. And there's a reason for that. Up until that time, most people were farmers, which means they were self-sustaining. They raised what they needed to eat, they built what they needed to live in, and they built what they needed in terms of tools, and then they did very minor trade. What we learned from the first couple chapters is that economic factors of production are scarce. The economic problem is one of unlimited wants with scarce resources, and we said we need to be efficient with those resources. Doing everything yourself is not efficient, and we showed that using the example during Chapter 2 with trade-offs with the person building the birdhouse and the bird feeder. There is certain trade-offs that are made, i.e. if you're trying to do everything yourself, you're not going to be as efficient. And if you're not as efficient, that means you're not going to sustain long-term economic growth. Most economists disagree on a lot of items, depending on whether you're a demand sider or Keynesian, a supply sider, whether you're monetarist, whether you're a neo-Marxist. But most economists can agree on one thing, is that economic growth is not likely to occur unless a government provides the necessary type of institutional framework. What we mean by institutional framework is by having a set of laws and regulations that does not punish success but rewards risk. We want entrepreneurs to put together the factors of production to continue to grow our economy. Getting back to what we spoke about a few minutes ago, from 1 million BC to about 1300, we really experienced no economic growth. Again, because most people were self-sustaining. They were hunter-gatherers or they were agrarians growing what they needed. From about 1300 to 1800, we saw some minor growth, about 0.2%. The reason being people started to put together economic systems of trade, creating currencies to trade, creating trade routes becoming more prevalent. From 1800 to 1900, we saw about 1.3% annual economic growth in real GDP. Again, this was the later part of the Industrial Revolution in London and the beginning part of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And in the 1900s or the 20th century, we saw about a 2.3% annual growth in real GDP per capita, meaning as more and more countries were starting to become industrialized and they were specializing in production, more and more trade routes were established, more and more trade treaties were established, and trade-offs and opportunity cost and absolute comparative advantage were analyzed and used much more effectively to the countries and to the citizens' benefit. But we have to look at looking at growth rates. We really need to establish or distinguish between a strong or mature economy versus an emerging economy. Strong economies like the United States that have very large real GDPs of approximately $13.8 trillion grow at a much slower pace than developing countries grow. The reason being, when you're that big, even if you have a relatively large rate of growth year over year in terms of whole numbers, the percentage of growth is small because the denominator is going to be larger. For example, if you take a country that has a $2 trillion economy and they grow at $200 billion, they experience 10% growth. But take a country with a $10 trillion economy and they grow at 200 billion in whole dollars, they only experience 2% growth. They grew at the same number, the same whole number, but their rates were different because their bases are different. And when you do the calculation, a smaller numerator gives you a smaller denominator gives you a greater rate of return. Now, in the long run, compounding 10, 20, 30 years, small differences in economic growth rates will result in big differences in standards of living. For example, a 2% rate of growth over a 20-year period will account for about a 50% overall growth rate in a number. A 3% growth rate will account for about 70%. That's a big difference in someone's standard of living. To try to quantify it, that's the difference of living on $1,000 a week or $800 a week. What can you do more with? Increases in standards of living also have other effects in terms of people being able to provide better health services for themselves, or be able to afford better health services. The more people or the more wealth that people have, the better or bigger their incomes are, the more services will start to be established to help them live a better life or increase their standard of living. Here's an example of some demographic statistics comparing China and Japan. China is a growing economy. Japan is a maturing economy. Now, everyone thinks China is this big economic juggernaut, and they are growing and they are a large economy. But look at the differences in standard of living between China and Japan. Which citizens do you think experience a better standard of living? Another argument you hear from opponents of growth is that the rich only tend to get richer. And if you think about it from a common sense or an intuitive point of view, well, it makes sense because the old adage, it takes money to make money. That it's true. Remember, in order to grow and to succeed, you have to take a risk. Who's much more likely to take a risk? Someone who could afford to lose the money, or someone who cannot afford to? Usually, it's the former. Additionally, much like we said a few moments ago with economic growth rates, a person or two individual investors could both have 10% returns on their money. But if I'm starting with $100,000, a 10% return gives me $10,000. If I'm only investing $10,000, that same rate of return, 10%, only generates me a yield of $1,000. So overall, even though our rates of return are the same, my wealth has increased by 10 times the amount of your wealth because my investment base was 10 times as large as your wealth. This slide shows a map of the world as we know it. The countries shaded in green have GDP per capita is greater than $20,000. If you remember from last week, GDP per capita is basically the total GDP of a country divided by its population. What you could see by looking at the color codings is that the countries that have the highest rates of per capita GDP are also the countries that embrace free market capitalism. The reason being is they create a system that encourages people to take risks and to grow. And when people are taking risks, they tend to be more efficient with their economic resources. What are some of the determinants of how fast certain economies grow? Well, there is a model. Remember back to chapter 1, we talked about economic models of predicting future outcomes. The economic growth model is a model that explains growth rates in terms of real GDP per capita over the long run. It utilizes variables such as labor productivity, which is the quantity of goods and services that can be produced by one worker or by 1 hour of work. If in an hour of work I could produce 2 units and my neighbor in an hour of work can produce 3 units, my neighbor is more productive than I am by a 50% ratio. The third variable the economic model takes into account is technological change. Technological change is a change in the quantity of output a firm can produce using a given quantity of inputs, i.e., technological advancements make us more efficient. We could produce more units with the same amount of resources utilizing technology by limiting waste and limiting mistakes than we could previously. There are 3 main sources of technological change. The first is better machinery and equipment. Through time, people tend to tinker with designs of machines. They tend to create and invent new machines that make their jobs easier to do and better as we get better engineering and technology. We also have increases in human capital, which is basically an increase in the workforce. And as that workforce increases and as they work longer, they tend to gain experience and a knowledge base and a skill set which is referred to as their intellectual capital. The more you do something, the more you see it, the better you will be of correcting it if it ever occurs in the future. And finally, the third main source of technological change is a better means of organizing and managing production. The field of management science has come a long way. The use of statistical reports, the use of computers to organize and assign workloads to people have made it a lot easier for managers of businesses to utilize their human capital in a much more efficient manner. The per worker production function is the relationship between real GDP per hour worked and capital per hour worked, holding the level of technology constant. What they want to do in this instance is keeping technology the same, that is, taking out the effects of technological change which make people or make workers more efficient and more productive. They want to see how much a change in the capital per hour worked will result in, or I should say, the change in real GDP per hour worked based on an increase in the capital per hour worked. And remember, from an economic standpoint, capital is primarily plant and equipment. If you look at the per worker production function, you will see that we have a curve that starts out rising at a very fast rate and then starts to level off near the top. The reason being is that we all experience diminishing rates of return, meaning, or looking at the graph, to simplify, moving from $20,000 in capital per hour work to $30,000 increases real GDP by $150 from $200 to $350. An additional $10,000 increase to $30,000 to $40,000 only gives or nets a $125 increase in real GDP per hour work. Same amount, the same rate of change in terms of whole dollars, $10,000. from 20 to 30 and 30 to 40 starts to yield smaller and smaller returns. When we look at the move from 40 to 50, we see that we only now have an increase of $100 of real GDP per hour worked. So what we can see is that we can only become more efficient to a point. We will need technological change to enhance all of the other variables. Otherwise, we will be working for a diminished return. Going back to the concept we studied, chapters 1 and 2, marginal cost equaling marginal benefit. It comes to a point where marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit, even though you're yielding much more effective or much more product. But is that product that you're producing worth what you are giving up, what you're putting into it? So the question is asked, what is more important for economic growth? More capital or technological change? As we just said, increases in technological change helps economies avoid diminishing returns on capital. And since capital is a factor of production, and factors of production are resources, and we know resources are scarce, we need to be as efficient as possible with those resources.